A boy stands in a drafty timber house on the edge of the Victorian goldfields, listening to grown men argue about wages, rent, and whether tomorrow will bring work or hunger. He has no inheritance, no connections, not even the certainty of finishing school. And yet, against every rule of the era, this boy will one day become Prime Minister of Australia. Not by charm, not by wealth, not by war medals, by words, by stubbornness, by walking straight into the machinery of power with nothing but a conscience and a clock ticking louder every year. James Henry Scullin is born on 18th of September 1876 in Trawalla, near Ballarat, country shaped by mining booms and busts, by sudden fortune and sudden ruin. His parents are Irish Catholics. His father, John Scullin, works where he can. Labor, odd jobs, whatever keeps the family upright. His mother, Anne, holds the household together with the kind of discipline poverty demands. Stretch the food, patch the clothes, keep the children alive. There are 9 children, 9 mouths, 9 futures competing for the same thin slice of opportunity. The landscape of Scullin's childhood is not romantic. It's practical. It's the sound of boots on dirt, the smell of smoke and damp wool, the constant arithmetic of survival. In that world, education is a luxury until a teacher notices something in the quiet boy with the sharp eyes. James is bright. Not good at school bright, dangerous bright. The kind of mind that remembers what it reads and then asks why the world doesn't match it. He attends the local state school and does well enough to win a scholarship to continue at Ballarat College. For a moment, the path seems to open, but the family can't afford to keep him there. The scholarship helps, but it doesn't pay for everything. Books, clothes, the lost wages of a son who could be working. At 14, the door closes. He leaves formal schooling behind, not because he wants to, but because necessity doesn't negotiate. That's the first pressure point in his life. The sense of time being stolen. Not wasted, stolen. He will carry it like a splinter. And it will shape him into a man who reads at night when others sleep, who teaches himself what the system refused to provide, who never forgets what it feels like to be told politely that your life is too expensive to educate. He becomes an apprentice grocer in Ballarat. It's steady work, the kind that keeps you on your feet all day, measuring flour, stacking tins, watching customers count coins with embarrassed fingers. It's also a front row seat to the quiet humiliations of poverty. People buying the cheapest cuts, asking for credit, pretending they're not desperate. Scullin watches, he listens, he stores it all away. And then he finds his real university. Books, newspapers, and the debating halls of working-class politics. He reads history and economics, but also speeches, cadences, arguments, the architecture of persuasion. He joins the Australian Natives Association for a time, but his deeper pull is toward labor politics, where the questions are raw and immediate. Who gets paid? Who gets protected? Who gets crushed? Ballarat is a furnace of political energy. The labor movement is growing, unions are organizing, and the new Commonwealth of Australia, federated in 1901, is still an experiment. He's still deciding what kind of nation it will be. For a young man with a sharp mind and a memory of hunger, politics isn't a hobby. It's a tool, maybe the only tool. Scullin starts speaking at meetings. At first, he's not the loudest voice. He doesn't have the swagger of a born showman, but he has something more unsettling: clarity. He can take a complicated issue, tariffs, wages, arbitration, and make it feel personal, like it's happening in your kitchen. He speaks with moral force, the kind that makes opponents roll their eyes and supporters sit up straighter. In 1903, still in his 20s, he runs for federal parliament in the seat of Ballarat as a Labour candidate. It's an audacious move for a grocer's apprentice turned shopman, a man without money or pedigree. He loses. The defeat is not glamorous. It's the kind of loss that could end a political dream before it begins. But Scullin doesn't treat it like a verdict. He treats it like a lesson. He keeps working, he keeps organizing, he keeps speaking, and he keeps writing. Because writing, for him, is another form of fighting. In 1906, he becomes editor of the Evening Echo, a small labor newspaper in Ballarat. This is where his voice sharpens into a weapon. The press at the time is not neutral. It's partisan, combative, often brutal. Newspapers don't just report politics, they make it. As editor, Scullin is suddenly in the engine room of public opinion, choosing which stories matter, which injustices get named, which arguments get repeated until they stick. Picture him late at night, ink on his fingers, the smell of paper and metal type, the clatter of the press like a heartbeat. He writes about wages and working conditions, about the dignity of labor, about the responsibilities of government. He attacks complacency. He attacks privilege. He attacks the idea that poverty is a personal failure instead of a social design. And he does it while living the life he's describing. No mansion, no cushion, no escape hatch. In 1907, he marries Sarah Maria McNamara, known as Sari. Their partnership is steady and private, built for endurance rather than spectacle. Politics is a jealous calling, and the life ahead will demand long absences, constant stress, and public scrutiny. Sari becomes the quiet center of his life, the person who keeps the human world intact while he wrestles with the public one. Scullin's Catholic background matters, but not in the simplistic way outsiders might assume. It gives him a moral vocabulary, duty, justice, the worth of the poor, but he is not a sectarian firebrand. He is above all a Democrat with a conscience. He believes government should be an instrument of fairness, not a referee that shrugs while the strong win by default. As the years pass, he becomes more than a local activist. He becomes a figure in the Labor Party's internal life. Committees, conferences, policy debates that can feel like trench warfare conducted in suits. The party itself is not a monolith. It's a coalition of unions, social reformers, pragmatists, idealists. It argues constantly about how far to push, how fast to move, what to compromise, what to refuse. Scullin's temperament is serious, even austere. He is not a man who enjoys politics as theater. He enjoys it as purpose. That makes him respected and sometimes underestimated. In an era when charisma can carry a room, Scullin's power is quieter. He convinces people who came prepared to disagree. In 1910, he tries again for parliament, contesting Ballarat once more. This time he wins. The victory is not just personal, it's symbolic. A man who left school at 14 because his family couldn't afford it is now a member of the House of Representatives in the young Commonwealth Parliament. He walks into a chamber built on British tradition, filled with men who sound like certainty, and he brings with him the accent of the shop counter and the meeting hall. But the triumph comes with a new kind of pressure, the pressure of proving you belong. In Parliament, Scullin is diligent. He studies bills, speaks carefully, and focuses on issues that matter to working people. He is not a flamboyant performer. He is a worker in a workplace of power. Then history begins to tilt. The First World War arrives like a storm that doesn't ask permission. Australia, tied to Britain, is pulled into a conflict that will devour a generation. The war doesn't just change foreign policy, it tears domestic politics apart. The question of conscription, forcing men to serve overseas, becomes a national wound. Families split, communities fracture. The Labor Party itself is ripped open. Scullin takes a stand against conscription, not because he is indifferent to the war's horror, but because he believes coercion will poison democracy and punish the working class disproportionately. It is a position that costs friendships and invites accusations of disloyalty. In wartime, nuance is treated like betrayal. The loudest voices demand simple answers. Yes or no, patriot or traitor. Scullin chooses no, and he pays for it. In 1916 and 1917, Australia holds bitter referendums on conscription. The campaigns are vicious. Public meetings turn hostile. Newspapers scream. People are shouted down in the street. The Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, splits from Labour and forms a new political alignment, dragging much of the establishment with him. The country is in political freefall, and the war keeps grinding on. Scullin's opposition to conscription aligns him with the Labour base, but it also places him in the crosshairs of a public mood that can turn ugly. He is not a man built for hatred, yet he has to walk through it. He keeps speaking anyway. Then in 1917, he loses his seat. The defeat is part of a broader collapse for Labour in the wartime climate. For Scullin, it's another door slamming shut, another reminder that politics can take everything and give nothing back. He returns to journalism, becoming editor of the Labour Call in Melbourne. If Parliament is the battlefield of votes, the press is the battlefield of ideas, and Scullin goes back to war with ink. The Labour Call is not just a newspaper, it's a lifeline for a movement trying to survive the post-split chaos. Scullin writes to rebuild morale, to argue policy, to keep the party's identity from dissolving into bitterness. These are not easy years. The war ends, but the scars remain. Returned soldiers come home to a country that praises them and then struggles to employ them. Inflation bites, industrial disputes flare. The political landscape is crowded with new resentments and old fears. And Scullin, now in his 40s, is still chasing the same mission. make the system answer to the people it uses. He tries to return to Parliament in 1918 in a by-election for Corangamite and loses. Another rejection, another reminder that conviction doesn't guarantee victory. But each loss hardens his patience. He is learning something crucial. Politics is not a single climb. It's a long siege. Behind the scenes, he becomes more influential inside the Labour Party. He is trusted as a thinker, a policy man, someone who can be relied on to do the unglamorous work. He attends conferences, helps shape platforms, and builds relationships across factions. He is not a factional warlord. He is a bridge, sometimes strained, sometimes stubborn, but always trying to hold the structure together. And time keeps moving. The boy from Trawala is no longer young. The years of reading late, writing hard, and fighting internal battles have etched themselves into his face. He has a family life that must coexist with public life, and a sense, quiet but persistent, that his window may not stay open forever. Then comes 1922. Scullin contests the seat of Yarra in Melbourne, a working-class electorate with strong labor roots. This time he wins. He is back in the House of Representatives, not as a newcomer, but as a man tempered by defeat, sharpened by war-era conflict, and armed with a deeper understanding of how fragile political movements can be. He takes his seat with a different kind of urgency, not the impatience of youth, but the pressure of a man who knows how quickly history can turn. He has seen a party split in half. He has watched public opinion become a weapon. He has felt the floor drop out beneath him. And now, as Australia moves into the uneasy prosperity of the 1920s, beneath which debt, inequality, and global instability are quietly accumulating, Scullin is stepping back into the arena with a clock ticking in his chest. The knowledge that the next crisis won't ask whether he's ready, because somewhere beyond the horizon, the world economy is already beginning to tremble. And when it breaks, it won't just test governments. It will test the very idea of what a leader is allowed to do. For James Scullin, the real fight, the one that will define him, elevate him, and nearly destroy him, is still ahead. In the late 1920s, Australia looks like a country finally catching its breath. City streets glitter with new cars. Shop windows promise modern comfort. Politicians talk about sound finance, the way priests talk about salvation. And then, like a trap door opening under a crowded room, the world economy begins to give way. James Scullin has waited years to matter again. He's back in Parliament for Yarra, older now, leaner in spirit, with the memory of defeat still fresh enough to sting. He isn't a man who believes history is kind. He believes it's hungry, and he can feel it circling. In Canberra, Scullin builds a reputation as Labour's steady mind. Serious, policy-focused, not intoxicated by applause. When the party needs someone to argue the case without theatrics, they send Scullin. When they need someone to hold the line in internal disputes, they lean on him. He becomes treasurer in the Labour Shadow Ministry, then a central figure in shaping economic policy, tariffs, industry, employment, because he understands something many comfortable men don't. When money tightens, it tightens first around the poor. By 1928, the conservative nationalist government under Stanley Bruce is wobbling. Bruce has tied himself to unpopular industrial relations reforms and a sense that government should discipline labor rather than protect it. The mood in the country is shifting, quietly at first, then with the force of a tide. In 1929, Bruce calls an election. It's meant to be a show of strength. Instead, it becomes a political shockwave. Bruce loses not only government, but his own seat, an almost unthinkable humiliation for a sitting prime minister. Labour wins, and James Scullin, bookish, earnest, not built like a conqueror, becomes Prime Minister of Australia. It should be the moment the boy from the drafty timber house finally gets to breathe. He doesn't, because the victory arrives with the fuse already burning. The Wall Street crash has happened. At first it feels distant, like thunder over another continent. Then the numbers start coming in like casualty reports. Export prices collapse, overseas loans dry up, unemployment climbs, then surges. Men who had been working one week are lining up for relief the next. Families begin to sell furniture, then tools, then hope. In some suburbs, the hungry are not a statistic. They are a line that wraps around a building. And Scullin walks into office with a brutal time limit. Australia's overseas debts don't pause for elections. Interest payments are due. Creditors are watching. The Commonwealth's finances are a tightrope, and the wind is rising. He inherits a system that is not designed for mercy. Australia's financial architecture is tangled between the federal government, the states, and the banks. The Commonwealth Bank, created to serve the nation, has a board that thinks like a private institution guarding its own purity. The Bank of England's shadow hangs over everything. The old imperial reflex that says a responsible country pays its debts, even if its people starve. Scullin's first months are a blur of urgent decisions and impossible arithmetic. He wants to protect wages, maintain employment, keep public works going, because stopping spending in a depression is like cutting the ropes on a sinking ship to make it lighter. But the orthodox voices, bankers, conservative economists, much of the press, demand the opposite. Cut spending, cut wages, balance. Budgets restore confidence. Confidence, it becomes the word that haunts him. Confidence for whom? The unemployed man with empty pockets? Or the bondholder in London? Inside his own party, the ground is already cracking. Labor is not one mind, it is a coalition under stress. Some demand radical action, repudiation of debts, expansion of credit, aggressive public spending. Others fear that defying financial orthodoxy will trigger total collapse. Capital flight, currency crisis, international isolation. Scullin is caught between two nightmares, and both are real. Then comes the first twist of the knife. Scullin's government doesn't even control the Senate. The upper house is hostile. Legislation can be blocked. Every move is slower than the crisis. Every day lost is another factory closing, another family sliding into desperation. And the press, much of it conservative, doesn't treat him as a leader facing a global catastrophe. It treats him as a suspect. A Labor prime minister in a depression is, to many editors, not a firefighter, but an arsonist. Headlines sharpen. Cartoonists draw him as weak, confused, dangerous. The country's fear needs a face, and Scullin's face is available. He tries to build a national response. He convenes premiers' conferences, trying to coordinate federal and state action. But the states have their own debts, their own politics, their own panic. Premiers arrive with demands and threats. Some want the Commonwealth to shoulder more burden. Others want austerity so severe it feels like punishment. The meetings are not calm deliberations, they are pressure cookers. In 1930, Scullin makes a decision that will define the conflict at the heart of his prime ministership. He challenges the financial establishment directly by seeking to expand credit through the Commonwealth Bank to fund relief and public works. He believes the nation must use its own institutions to save its own people. The Commonwealth Bank Board refuses, not politely, firmly, ideologically. They insist on balanced budgets and orthodox policy. They fear inflation. They fear loss of international confidence. They fear, above all, setting a precedent that elected government can direct the nation's credit for social ends. So the Prime Minister of Australia finds himself in a surreal position, responsible for saving the country, but blocked by the very financial machinery meant to serve it. This is the real opposition Scullin faces. Not just the conservative parties, but a system of power that is not on the ballot. And then the clock speeds up. Australia's currency and credit position deteriorate. The government needs to refinance loans. It needs access to funds. It needs breathing room. Scullin decides he must go to London to negotiate directly, because the crisis is international, and Australia's fate is tied to decisions made in boardrooms and ministries half a world away. But leaving Australia in the middle of a depression is politically dangerous. It looks like abandonment, even if it's necessity. Scullin goes anyway, because the alternative is to sit in Canberra and watch the country bleed out while waiting for permission to apply a bandage. He departs in 1930, and the moment he is gone, the tension inside his government turns into open fracture. His deputy, Frank Anstey, and others push for more radical monetary policy. In New South Wales, Premier Jack Lang becomes the loudest voice of defiance, arguing for suspending interest payments to British bondholders. Until Australians are fed and employed, Lang's rhetoric is electric, populist, and furious. To desperate people, it sounds like courage. To conservatives, it sounds like revolution. To Scullin, it is both a political threat and a moral challenge, because Lang is speaking to real suffering, but offering a path that could shatter the nation's financial standing. While Scullin is in London, the government's internal unity weakens. Ministers argue, factions harden, the public sees confusion. The opposition smells blood. In London, Scullin faces a different kind of cold. Not weather, attitude. He is received as a debtor, not an equal. The imperial relationship reveals its true shape in a crisis. Australia may be a nation, but its credit is treated like a colonial obligation. Scullin presses for better terms, for understanding, for flexibility. He is not asking for luxury, he is asking for survival. He returns to Australia with limited gains and a political landscape that has worsened in his absence. Unemployment is staggering. Relief is inadequate. Anger is rising. And now inside Labour, the split is no longer a risk. It is a countdown. Scullin tries to hold the centre. He supports a plan for economic recovery that becomes known as the Premier's Plan, an agreement between federal and state governments. That includes severe spending cuts, wage reductions, and measures aimed at restoring financial stability. To many, it is the only way to keep Australia solvent and avoid total financial collapse. To others, it is betrayal, balancing budgets on the backs of the poor. Scullin's tragedy is that he is not choosing between good and bad. He is choosing between bad and worse, in a storm where every decision injures someone. And the party begins to tear itself apart in public. Jack Lang's supporters in federal parliament, Lang Labour, refuse to accept the Premier's plan. They want repudiation, defiance, a break with orthodoxy. On the other side, Joseph Lyons, a senior minister and a respected figure, becomes increasingly uncomfortable with Labour's direction and internal chaos. Lyons is not a firebrand. He is a cautious man, and caution in a crisis can become its own kind of rebellion. Then comes the moment that feels like a betrayal from within. Lyons resigns from the Scullin government. He crosses the floor. He joins with conservatives and other defectors to form a new political force that will soon become the United Australia Party. It is a stunning reversal. Labour's own minister becoming the face of responsible anti-Labour government. Scullin is now fighting on three fronts at once: the conservative opposition, the financial establishment, and a civil war inside his own movement. The public watches the spectacle and feels only the pain in their own lives. They don't care about factional theory when their children are hungry. They don't care about constitutional nuance when rent is due. They want action, and all they see is paralysis. In Parliament, numbers become weapons. Votes are counted like bullets. The government's majority is fragile, then vanishes. Every sitting day carries the threat of collapse. Scullin, who came to power on a wave of hope, is now trying to keep the ship afloat while crew members fight on deck. And the imagery of the time is brutal. Men sleeping in parks, soup kitchens, families evicted, shanty towns on the edges of cities. The Great Depression is not an abstract downturn. It is a national humiliation, a grinding fear that tomorrow will be worse. Scullin's opponents paint him as weak. His critics on the left paint him as heartless. The bankers treat him as irresponsible. The radicals treat him as captured. He is, in reality, a man trying to govern a catastrophe with tools that were never built for catastrophe. The final twist is that the very qualities that brought him to the top, his seriousness, his moral weight, his refusal to perform, now work against him. In a crisis, the public often wants a voice that sounds like certainty, even if certainty is a lie. Scullin speaks like a man who knows the complexity, and complexity is hard to love when you're desperate. By late 1931, the government is bleeding support. The Lang split deepens. The Lyons defection strengthens the opposition. The parliamentary arithmetic turns lethal. Scullin's time limit is no longer just economic. It is political, measured in sitting days and confidence votes. And then it happens. The government falls. An election is called. The country, exhausted and frightened, turns away from Labour in a landslide. Joseph Lyons, once Scullin's colleague, becomes Prime Minister. The man who had carried the burden of the Depression's first most savage years is pushed out, not with a dramatic coup, but with the cold finality of numbers. Scullin leaves office in January 1932, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as something rarer and harder to explain: a leader crushed. Between human need and institutional power, between the hunger in the streets and the iron rules of finance. And as he walks back into opposition, the question hanging over him is not whether he tried. It's whether, in the Australia of that era, trying was ever going to be enough. The day after the election, the headlines are already writing his obituary as a leader. Not a literal death, something colder. The kind of death that happens when a country decides you were the wrong man for the worst moment. James Scullin sits back on the opposition benches while unemployment still stalks the streets like a silent animal. And the new Prime Minister, Joseph Lyons, the man who once sat at Scullin's own cabinet table, wears the mantle of stability like a freshly pressed suit. But here's the twist that makes Scullin's story dangerous to tell in simple slogans. The crisis doesn't end when he loses office. The Depression doesn't politely pack up and leave because the voters change their minds. The pain keeps going. And Scullin, defeated, exhausted, publicly blamed, does something that doesn't fit the caricature of a failed prime minister. He keeps working. He returns to Parliament not as a broken man begging for relevance, but as a stubborn, methodical figure who refuses to let the country forget what the storm looked like from inside it. He is still the member for Yarra, still the son of working-class Catholics, still the man who learned early that dignity can be stripped away by forces that don't care how hard you pray or how honestly you labor. And now he has a new enemy. Not the Commonwealth Bank Board, not the Senate arithmetic, not even Jack Lang's theatrical defiance, but the national temptation to rewrite the past into a comforting lie. Because Lyon's government, backed by conservative forces and much of the press, has every incentive to turn Scullin into a cautionary tale. Labor equals chaos. Austerity equals salvation. Scullin knows how this works. He's seen it in the editorials, in the cartoons, in the way confidence is treated like a god that must be fed with wage cuts and human misery. If that story hardens into permanent truth, then the next time a crisis hits, the same people will be sacrificed again, only faster. So he becomes, in opposition, a kind of living cross-examination. In the early 1930s, Parliament is still a battleground over what the Depression means and who gets to define it. Scullin speaks with the weary authority of someone who has watched the machinery seize up in real time. He argues that the catastrophe was global, that Australia's dependence on export prices and overseas borrowing made it vulnerable, and that the solutions sold as moral discipline were often just the preferences of those least likely to suffer. He doesn't deny mistakes. He doesn't pretend his government had a magic lever it refused to pull. But he refuses to accept the convenient myth that the poor were rescued by being punished. And then slowly, the political landscape shifts again, because history never stays still long enough for anyone to feel safe. The Labour Party, shattered by the splits of the Scullin years, begins the long, painful process of rebuilding. The Lang faction's drama fades from the center of federal politics. The party searches for a new identity that can survive both economic crisis and internal civil war. Scullin is no longer the leader, but he is not a ghost either. He becomes a senior figure whose experience is both a warning and a resource. Younger members look at him and see what happens when ideals collide with institutions that don't answer to voters. And Scullin, for his part, is not interested in revenge. He is interested in leverage, how to make the system bend, even slightly, toward ordinary people. One of the strangest ironies of his post-prime ministership is that his most lasting influence comes not from dramatic speeches, but from persistence in the slow, technical fights that decide whether a nation is run for citizens or for balance sheets. He takes a particular interest in monetary policy and banking, because he has lived through the moment when an elected government asked for credit to fight mass unemployment and was told no by men who were never on a ballot paper. The Commonwealth Bank remains central to this story. In Scullin's time as Prime Minister, it had been a fortress of orthodoxy, with a board determined to keep political hands off the levers of credit. After his fall, the question doesn't disappear. If anything, it grows sharper. Should a national bank serve national survival, or should it serve financial doctrine? Scullin keeps pushing the argument that the nation's credit is not a private treasure chest guarded by a priesthood. It is a public instrument, and if it cannot be used in an emergency to prevent hunger and collapse, then what is it for? This is not a glamorous crusade. It doesn't produce cinematic victories. It produces committee work, parliamentary pressure, and the slow accumulation of ideas that will matter later, especially as the world edges toward another catastrophe. Because while Australia is still limping out of the Depression, the 1930s darken overseas. In Europe, authoritarianism rises with the confidence of a fire that has found dry timber. In Asia, Japan expands aggressively. The news carries names that feel distant at first: Abyssinia, Spain, Munich, until the distance begins to shrink. And in Australia, the political argument starts to change shape, from how to survive economic collapse to how to survive a world sliding toward war. Scullin watches this with a grim familiarity. He knows what it means when leaders promise certainty in exchange for obedience. He knows how quickly fear can be weaponized. And he knows that war, like depression, always sends the bill to the same addresses. When the Second World War arrives, it rearranges everything. The Lyons era ends. Lyons dies in office in 1939, and Australia cycles through leadership turmoil before John Curtin, a Labour Prime Minister, takes the helm in 1941. For Scullin, this is another twist of fate. The Labour Party returns to power under a leader who will face a crisis even more existential than the Depression. Scullin is no longer at the center, but he is close enough to feel the heat. Curtin's government must mobilize the economy, direct industry, manage manpower, and coordinate with allies while Australia itself is threatened in the Pacific. The old orthodoxies about limited government and balanced budgets are suddenly less sacred. In wartime, the state does what it must. Credit expands, controls are imposed, production is directed. The very things Scullin had argued were necessary in a depression, decisive national coordination, the use of public financial power, become normal under the pressure of survival. It is a bitter vindication, not triumphant, bitter, because it suggests that what was impossible when people were starving became necessary when bombs were falling. Scullin doesn't need to say it out loud for the point to land. And yet, even as the war validates some of his instincts, it also underlines his tragedy. He had tried to fight an economic war with peacetime rules against institutions that refused to treat unemployment as an emergency. Curtin, facing military war, is granted powers and unity Scullin never had. The contrast is stark enough to sting. As the 1940s progress, Scullin's role becomes that of an elder statesman, respected, consulted, but increasingly constrained by age and health. He remains in Parliament through the war years, watching Australia transform. The federal government grows stronger, the economy becomes more managed, and the idea of national planning, once denounced as reckless, becomes part of the accepted toolkit. Then comes another turning point that feels almost like history offering a delayed apology. In 1945, after the war, the Curtin government, now led by Ben Chifley after Curtin's death, moves to reshape Australia's financial system. Chifley, like Scullin, is a Labour man with a deep belief that finance should serve the public. The government pushes for greater public control over banking and credit. The Commonwealth Bank's role evolves. The long argument about who commands the nation's money, elected representatives or insulated boards, returns with force. Scullin watches this with the quiet intensity of someone seeing an old wound reopened, not to hurt again, but to finally be cleaned. He had fought the Commonwealth Bank Board in the early 1930s and lost. Now a Labour government is strong enough, and the world has changed enough, to challenge the old order more directly. He doesn't get to claim the victory as his own. Politics doesn't work that way, but the line from his struggle to these reforms is real. The questions he raised about democratic control, about the moral cost of confidence, about whether a nation can use its own credit to protect its people are no longer fringe questions. They are central to post-war reconstruction. And still, the personal cost remains. Scullin's health deteriorates. The years of strain, prime ministership in the Depression, then the long grind of opposition, have taken their toll. He is not a man who ages gently. There is a heaviness to him now, a sense that the fight has moved on without him, even as it proves him right in fragments. He continues as the member for Yarra until 1949, when he finally retires from Parliament. By then, he has served for decades, including the most punishing period any Australian leader had yet faced. Retirement does not turn him into a celebrity elder. He is not built for that. He does not reinvent himself as a grand public oracle. He becomes quieter, more private, living with the knowledge that his name will always be tied to the Depression, often as a symbol, sometimes as a scapegoat, rarely as a fully understood human being. And that is where the final tension of his story lives, in the gap between what he was and what people needed him to be. Australia, like most countries, prefers its leaders in simple shapes. Hero or villain, genius or fool, Scullin doesn't fit. He was a man of conscience and caution, a reformer who feared chaos, a Labour leader who accepted austerity because he believed the alternative might be national insolvency and deeper ruin. He tried to hold a centre while the ground split beneath him. He tried to negotiate with London while his own party combusted. He tried to use national institutions to fight mass unemployment and discovered that those institutions could say no to the elected government. His real opponent was not a single rival, but a structure. The interlocking power of finance, constitutional limits, hostile media, and internal party fracture, colliding with a global economic collapse that did not care who won elections. And the time limit that defined him, the countdown of debt payments, collapsing export prices, and vanishing credit, never gave him the one thing a leader needs to look strong: time to make a plan work. When James Scullin dies in 1953, Australia is already becoming a different country from the one that broke him. The post-war economy is stronger. The welfare state is more developed. The federal government's capacity is larger. The idea that government can and should intervene in the economy is no longer automatically treated as heresy. The Commonwealth's relationship to banking and credit has shifted. Not perfectly, not permanently, but shifted. And if you look back from that later Australia to the early 1930s, you can see Scullin not as the man who failed, but as the man who stood at the hinge of eras, when the old rules were dying, but the new rules had not yet been written. He was the prime minister who walked into a burning house carrying a bucket, only to be told the water belonged to someone else. And he never stopped insisting that it shouldn't. If you want the cruelest contrast in politics, it's this. The man who once held the highest office in the country ends his days not with a parade, not with a monument, but with a quiet body that simply can't keep up anymore, while the arguments he bled for keep, marching on without his name attached. James Scullin leaves Parliament in 1949 after nearly 4 decades in public life, and there's no cinematic closing scene, no last triumphant vote, no final speech that fixes his reputation in a single sentence. He steps away because time, his oldest enemy, has finally tightened its grip. The same time pressure that crushed him as prime minister in the early 1930s returns in a different form. Not debt deadlines and collapsing export prices now, but a failing heart, a body worn down by years of strain, and the slow, humiliating truth that even the most stubborn can't negotiate with biology. And yet the story doesn't fade. It sharpens. Because the moment Scullin retires, Australia is entering a new age of confidence. Post-war growth, expanding government capacity, a barrage, stronger safety net, a country that has learned painfully that doing nothing is also a decision with a body count. The irony is almost unbearable. The nation is finally living inside the kind of state power that would have made the Depression years less savage, and the man who tried to push Australia toward that reality is now too tired to argue his own case. He returns to private life in Melbourne, still rooted in the world that formed him. Working-class streets, Catholic community, the stubborn decency of people who don't have the luxury of treating politics as a game. He is not wealthy. He is not insulated. He is not one of those ex-leaders who glide into boardrooms and after-dinner circuits. Scullin's reward is quieter. A pension, modest security, and the company of family and old comrades. The spotlight moves on quickly because the country is busy building new myths. And that's where the next twist lands. Scullin's reputation doesn't simply recover with time. It gets fought over. In the public memory, the Depression becomes a story people want to simplify. They want a villain they can point at, a single face to pin the fear onto, so the chaos feels containable. Scullin is convenient. He is the prime minister when everything fell apart. He is the man whose government split. He is the leader who couldn't stop unemployment from swallowing whole suburbs. It doesn't matter that the catastrophe was global, that commodity prices collapsed, that overseas credit froze, that the financial system was built to protect lenders before workers. A public that has survived trauma often wants a clean narrative more than a true one. And Scullin, out of office, out of the daily fight, can't correct every distortion. He can't answer every cartoon. He can't chase every lazy line in a newspaper column. He has to live with the fact that history is written not only by winners, but by people who are tired of complexity. Still, he isn't erased, not completely. Inside labor circles, among those who remember the machinery of government and the brutal constraints of the early 1930s, Scullin becomes something else. A cautionary figure, yes, but also a witness. The man who can say, with the authority of scars, what it feels like when democratic power hits an unelected wall. The man who learned in real time that you can win an election and still not control the levers that decide whether people eat. And as the late 1940s and early 1950s unfold, the political world around him grows sharper, colder. The labor movement is now fighting new internal battles, especially over anti-communism and the shape of the party's future. The country is entering the Menzies era, with its own long shadow. The headlines are no longer about breadlines and bank boards. They're about loyalty, ideology, and the anxieties of the Cold War. Scullin watches this from the outside, and there's a quiet tragedy in it. He spent his life battling economic forces that crushed ordinary people. And now the national conversation is shifting to different fears, different enemies. But the old questions never truly disappear. They just change costumes. What is government for? Who does it serve when the pressure rises? When a crisis hits, do we protect confidence first or people first? Scullin's entire career is a long argument with those questions. And even when his name isn't spoken, the argument remains. Then the clock runs down. On 28th January 1953, James Scullin dies at the age of 76. No dramatic final confrontation, no last-minute redemption arc, just the end of a life that carried too much weight for too long. The man who once sat in the Prime Minister's chair during the worst economic collapse Australia had ever known is gone. And the country does what countries do. It pauses, it notes the passing, and it keeps moving. But if you zoom in, if you imagine the scene not as a headline but as a room, you can feel the strange stillness of it. A former Prime Minister, once surrounded by the noise of Parliament and the roar of crisis, now reduced to silence. The body that endured those years finally stops. And the question hangs there, uncomfortably human. Was it worth it? Because Scullin's life is not the story of a man who got everything he wanted. It's the story of a man who kept pushing anyway. He never became a legend in the easy way. He didn't get the clean victory that turns a politician into a national saint. His prime ministership is still, for many, a synonym for disaster. Despite the fact that the disaster was already in motion when he arrived, he is remembered for the split, for the austerity, for the sense of helplessness that clung to government in those years like smoke. And yet look at what Australia became after him. A country more willing to accept that government must act in emergencies. A country that expanded social protections. A country that, through war and reconstruction, learned that national coordination and public financial power are not radical fantasies but practical tools. The very idea that the state can mobilize resources at scale, so obvious in wartime, so contested in depression, became part of the national toolkit. Scullin didn't build all of that. He didn't even live to see it fully mature. But he stood at the hinge point when the old rules were failing and the new rules were still unspeakable. And that is his real legacy. Not a list of laws with his signature on them, but a lesson carved into the national memory, whether the nation admits it or not. He showed what happens when a leader tries to govern with compassion inside a system designed to prioritize creditors, orthodoxy, and confidence. He showed how quickly a party can tear itself apart when fear and ideology collide. He showed that institutions can be independent in ways that make democracy feel like theater. And he showed, painfully, that the public often punishes the messenger for the message of reality. There's a final image that fits him better than any statue. Picture a man in a suit that's slightly too heavy for his frame, shoulders carrying invisible weight, walking back into Parliament. After losing office, not to reclaim power, not to chase applause, but to keep arguing that a nation should be allowed to use its own strength to save its own people. No fireworks, no romance, just persistence. James Scullin's opponent was never only Joseph Lyons or Jack Lang or a hostile press. His opponent was the idea that suffering is a necessary proof of virtue, that unemployment is a moral failing, that the economy is a god and people are the offering. He fought that idea with the tools he had, words, votes, committees, stubbornness, and he paid for it with his reputation. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because sooner or later, every country meets a moment when the old rules stop working. When the comfortable explanations collapse, when leaders are handed a burning house and told to put it out with a thimble, in those moments the question isn't whether the leader is perfect. The question is whether the system will allow survival to be treated as a priority. Scullin lived through that test before Australia had the language to describe it. He was judged as if he had chosen the fire. He didn't. He walked into it because it was there, and because someone had to.